From our perspective, looks at the lives and behaviors of millennials, Generation Z, and the changes that are happening in our 21st century and the innovators that are making it happen. We will explore trends, technology, music, fashion, social media, business, science, the arts, faith, and lifestyle. So come join us on Comcast, Verizon, and online. Welcome to From Our Perspective. Today I have two guests, wonderful guests with me today. Ms. Stephanie Maxwell and Mr. Matthew Maxwell.
Hello, everyone. I'm Stephanie Red Maxwell, and I guess I'm blessed to be able to participate in this discussion with my oldest son, Matthew Maxwell, and background. So I'm an attorney, and I've also been a political appointee as a director, HR director. So I've been on local government on the executive side, and also on the judicial side when I retired as the court administrator. So my background is employment law and human resources management. My early background in my early years is journalism. So my background in schooling was journalism, human resources management, and the law. So all of that worked out into a very focused and eclectic at the same time career for me. So I love being involved in the community. I love mentorship. I love developing generations under me. I do trainings and presentations, and I have a podcast called the Wake Up Podcast. And that is more dealing with a talk show that deals with some of the social issues that we're dealing with now from a Christian perspective.
And Matthew.
I think this is also the first time my mom and I have been on a podcast together. This is kind of a cool mother-son moment. What's going on, everyone? My name is Matthew Maxwell. I'm currently over in Los Angeles at UCLA Anderson School of Management, getting my MBA. Eclectic is definitely the word to describe my career and background. I started my journey after graduating from Harvard, focused on econ and Wall Street, and quickly realized that my interests were far more in content creation, music, and entrepreneurship. Kind of got to learn and rediscover my family's background in music and creativity, which led me after a series of years to getting a master's in music production from Berklee College of Music, and eventually kicking off a company that's called Family First Music Group, where we make art, we create infrastructure to help the creation of art, and then try to get creatives paid accordingly for what they're contributing. Places I've lived have been LA, the DMV, shout out to Maryland, Boston, Valencia, Spain. And for those that are watching the pod and want to engage after, you can find me on Instagram or any other social media platform at I am Matt Max, and the Max has 2 X's in case you want to continue the discussion after this meeting.
Great. Well, thank you so much for introducing yourselves. What does that mean to you guys? Failure to fly. The definition by Oxford is fluttering, flying unsteadily, moving with a light, irregular, or trembling motion, beating feebly or irregularly. I use this term when we are talking about the generations Z and some millennials, of course, some Gen Zs and some millennials. What do you perceive this to mean, or do you understand it as something that we see in that generation, or even older generations or younger generations? What are your thoughts, Stephanie?
So beating feebly or irregularly, there used to be a term back in the older generation called failure to launch, where it just took you a minute to get started. Back then, getting started was very different, I think, expectation than it may be today. So I think that when we think about beating feebly or regularly, it's You can see a bird or something fluttering because when in looking at perspective at some of the young people I mentor, it's trying to figure out their purpose, what they like, what they don't like, because I think they may feel a little freer to explore. I think some of us in the older generation, it's like, what do you want to be? Doctor, lawyer, Indian chief. There were certain definitions and professions that were just clear and described, and you pick one of those, and then you matriculate into it or you study for that. Whereas I think that today there is a vast pool of all different types of careers and positions. And I think I can just speak, at least singularly right now. I'm not even going to put my HR hat on. We've allowed our younger people to explore more and to feel free, as opposed to putting them in a rut to say, you do this and you do that. So therefore, I think part of that is they may take even longer figuring out what that is than the traditional route of some. At least back when I went to school, there were three paths. You went straight into work, a third went straight to work, a third went to a vocation, and a third went to college. Those were the three tracks. And even high school was set up that way in terms of helping you align with your tracks early on. You don't have that kind of cheering today. And so I think that with some of that feeble or irregularity is because they're trying to figure it out. Sometimes they fall and get back up. Other times they're flying in a direction and realize this is not the direction I want to go in, And so I just see it may take a bit longer to figure out how you want to soar as opposed to us being placed in a direction and moving forward.
Matthew, your opinion on this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the term failure to fly, just as a phrase, is slightly misleading compared to the definitions underneath it. Like failure to fly would mean that if you're really translating this to being a bird and you failed to fly, well, then that bird is dead. Like functionally speaking, right? The bird didn't get out of the nest, so you're done. Versus this failure to fly is figuring out what does it mean to fly, right? Like fluttering, you're still in the air. Moving with an irregular pulse, you're still in the air. Beating feebly or irregularly, again, you're still in the air, you're still surviving. I think by nature of one, technology and just having a lot more awareness of so many different paths that can be explored. I think every generation that we go backward on, there was less horizontal, maybe horizontal awareness might not be the right term, but just maybe less of like a global or holistic perspective on so many different paths that are available. Like that's why we have histories of like family businesses and like apprenticeship. It's like if your parent was a blacksmith, then you're going to be a blacksmith and their kids will be a blacksmith. Versus I think with the 90s into the 2000s, you have this new wave where you can actually get to know and at least see lifestyles, places, cultures, ways of living that are so foreign to what me as a millennial might have seen or known, that I think it invites more room for questions. And I think at least growing up as a kid for me, my parents really gave the question of like, what is purpose and, knowing what you're here, like in some ways to do. And I think purpose in general is a fairly dynamic question that can evolve and shift over time. And I just think there's a bit more room laterally to test things out which can then cause fluttering and figuring things out. Like in my journey of life, I was one of the cities I left off in my intro to my mother's point was New York. And I lived in Harlem and I was a Wall Street analyst. Like that was the path, the trajectory I was on. That's a very particular trajectory. And probably shortly in the shortest duration of my time there, I'm like, I know I'm here, but is this actually representative of me, my values, my personhood, the things that are most interesting? And I think maybe a difference is in prior generations, we have what is the midlife crisis, where, prior gens are like, oh, I'm in my, you know, late 40s, early 50s, and I'm wondering, what have I done and where's happening? I think it's moved backwards to more of an earlier stage questioning from almost conception of like, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? Where is this leading towards? And that then means that you're experimenting a lot more than I think what prior generations were accustomed to. And I think the implications of, having to experiment also then lead to, well, you need some space or room or capacity to experiment and to figure out what makes sense, which has economic and social, considerations. And you might be going against cultural trends and your history, you know what I mean? So it then creates this different, I think, generational schism that to me just feels like people finding themselves at a point where the conveyor belt pace of culture historically is kind of um shirked that or been like, oh no, once you're on the belt, you stay on the belt,
Right.
and like me, I'm like, well, what if I
Mhm.
don't like the belt? In fact, what if
Right.
I don't like the pants to the belt? You know what I mean?
Right, right,
So
right.
um and I think there was a culture too. The last thing I'll say is just, you can be you can be anything that you want to be, which is a different question from like or a different, declarative than doctor or lawyer, and then
Right.
maybe a financier, right? So I just think the inputs are a little bit different, and they've caused more of a trepidation might not be it, but just experimentation is how I'm thinking about it. So
And
I
it's so
just want to
funny.
add,
Yeah, sure. No problem.
I was just going to add something to what Matthew said in terms of, and then you figure out, do I want to do this? So I think also in terms of older generations, it's not that we may not have questioned the decision early on, we just stuck with it.
True.
We just stuck through it.
Yeah,
We
it's
just
true.
said, this is the path I chose. I'm just going to go through it. This is what I decided. For us, I think the midlife crisis came because you did stick through it. And then your midlife in your career and 45 and go, okay, I'm done. I'm tired. I need to. So because you plowed, you know, yeah, early on, I was a journalist. I think I told you that before we started recording. And for me, I said to myself, it may be a risky business and I want something a little more sure shot. I mean,
Mhm.
always knew I wanted to be a lawyer, so I kind of combined them. And I just said, instead of trying to venture into the journalism, because I was offered a position, I said, I'm going to just continue with law school and
Mhm.
become that lawyer and not take that job out in the Midwest somewhere, hopefully to come back to a big city. So we were also a little bit more risk averse as well.
Yeah. I think too, because so many of us were conformists to that. So you had a group of people around you who were like, I don't like this either, but so you figure that was life, that you're not going to like of your job. It's a job. You might like some parts of it and you settle for that. Yeah. So I think um, that understanding too is both great, what you mentioned. But I think this is a good segue to go to a video of a Gen Zer, two Gen Zers who were speaking on this topic. So I wanted you to hear it, and then we could come back to this. Okay.
The person who has somewhere to go isn't going to get as far as the person who likes walking. Right? They're not going to, yeah, basically the person who's focused on the destination, they're not going to walk as long or as hard as is required as someone who actually likes walking. So that's why it's best to stick with something that one you're either good at or that you enjoy. Because if you enjoy the journey, then the destination you don't have to worry about. The destination can have 20 different detours, and you're okay with that because, oh good, yeah, I get to keep walking. You know, whereas a lot of people get hung up on images they see of the destination, right? What it looked like, the house, the car, the business, the trophy, whatever. And sometimes they forget, okay, wait a minute, I'm going to have to be able to enjoy this because it's going to get difficult. And there are going to be moments where the environment around which, like my work environment, isn't going to be pleasant. I'm going to be facing failure a lot. I may very well be facing other people telling me I'm going to fail, and I have to be able to continue through that. And what else is going to keep you through that except for the simple fact that you actually like doing what you're doing and you believe in it that much. So
Yeah. So that's an interesting point, because on the flip side of failure to fly, you have, I succeeded, but I hate it.
yeah, no, but again, is that success though?
Yeah.
It's like, right? You know, because you imagine you failed to define success in the beginning, and so that's even worse.
Yeah.
You know, it's still a form of failure. It's like, okay, you get to the thing that everybody else said was valuable, only to find that that you didn't succeed.
Yeah.
You attained success as defined by the world, but at the cost of your own success. Yeah.
I mean, it's a lot that's kind of said, and I'm going to try to frame what I'm saying in a non-long-winded way, but there's the point of enjoying the journey, right? Versus destination-oriented thinking. I mean, I think that's a key for any proper like growth process. I think that's imperative, like on principle, right? Like, and I think the real question is, what elements do you enjoy versus don't enjoy? You know, I know some folks that don't necessarily love the day-to-day work that they're doing, but there's a different type of impact that they get through the work on the back end. So their joy or enjoyment of the process is really tied to a very different element of the journey than the day-to-day operation itself, right? And I think so much of that depends on your circumstances, the economic needs that you may or may not have. The take on failure and ending up at a different destination, there's a quote that goes around. I'm not sure who originated it, but to me, you really do only fail. And I've heard this quote from others, so I'm paraphrasing. You really only fail if you don't learn from what happened. Like, I don't know if I even fully believe in the concept of failure unless you stop moving, to be honest. Because I can kind of look at it from my own journey or perspective where sometimes you're on a path or a trajectory, and with the level of awareness that you have of self at the time, I know this in my case, the level of awareness I had in myself at the time when I was 22, graduated from college, and I was going to work on Wall Street, I was like, that was my mission. You know what I mean? That's what I wanted. I remember writing it down at 14. My mom has this book somewhere. It's like a middle school book. I'm like, I'm gonna graduate from Harvard and go work at Goldman Sachs. I didn't end up working at Goldman Sachs. I worked at BlackRock. But, you know, that was a successful point. It's just there were other considerations when it came to a lifestyle and a mission and purpose that I learned later on while I was in college in my late teens, early 20s, that then once I reached this point of success, I realized, oh shoot, there's a different type of success that I feel like I'm more built for. I might even throw in the word more called for. But the kind of key element to the whole thing was I went on a journey, and once I was met with like variables, if you will, or circumstances that were kind of less than ideal or not part of what I think my actual vocation was tied to, it's the awareness of like being able to then pivot from that and taking those lessons and moving on. So that's why I keep the failure to fly thing. It's like it's truly to me only failure when you just stop moving, because then I think there's a question of, well, if you've been doing something for 10 years and then you know you make this pivot, were the prior 10 years failure, or were those all development points to get to the point saying I'm going to make a shift now? You know, and then those prior years to me aren't, it's not failure, it's just development, it's growth. It's like in sports where, you know, the goal is the journey and the process of getting to these different destinations. And I think when you have that mentality, it just gives a different relationship to life, to vocation, and to work, which brings us to a different point of, do you have the infrastructure to make a pivot, which is an entirely different question.
Right.
And that deals with a lot of other factors, but I'll pause on my soliloquy there because
And just
my mom's thoughts. Yeah.
yeah, attached to what you're saying, I like what Anthony was saying in the sense that he was saying like you have to define not only success, because in understanding what that is, then you have to understand what your failure is. And
Yeah.
his analogy was walking. He says, you know, if you enjoy walking, you will keep walking, 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 walking,
Yeah.
and you're enjoying it, right? To
Right.
someone else who doesn't enjoy walking,
Right.
So even though you take 10 miles and you reach your destination or whatever, you enjoyed the destination because you enjoyed walking. As
Right.
somebody who did not like walking at all, and they just wanted to get to the destination, and they're like,
Right.
I could have done away with that 10 miles. I just wanted to
Right.
get here. So that process
Yeah.
is what I'm seeing also too, as to when we say failure to fly, who is defining the failure?
Right.
Who is defining fly? Is my fly,
Right.
I'm in the nest, I'm fluttering, or I'm in the nest, cleaning up the nest. Am I in the nest? You know what I'm saying? It's like,
Yeah. Yeah.
what do you
Yeah.
define my trajectory, or what do you define what I am doing as not necessary? Are you saying that it's not necessary, and that's why it's failure? Or is it that, because society has put those parameters, or those, as what Stephanie, you were saying, right? Society tells us these certain things that we are supposed to be doing at this stage in our lives. And before I go on to Stephanie, as to your take on the video we just saw, the other thing I was thinking of too is that, think of a person who has to take care of a parent or a sibling that is handicapped. They can't do the regular 9 to 5 job. Their job is to take care of that person. They will have their own self, because there are things that they wanted to do and they wanted to achieve. But their job of doing that for that household or for that family member is not failure. But society's like, oh, so what have you done with your life? You left high school. My mom was sick and I had to take care of her because there's nobody else had to take care of her. So that person may have had dreams, etc. But they're still doing something that is successful. They're still doing, but society puts that pressure on us and make us feel that we have failed. Stephanie, what do you think?
I think what Anthony said about the walking, which is, I thought, I said wisdom there, because, if you're a walker and you love walking, you're not going to think so much about the focus of hitting that 5 mile marker. You're just
Yeah.
enjoying the experience. And is it Corrie Ten Boom, who was, survivor of the concentration camp for helping Jews? She made it. She made a statement that stuck with me about. She gave a scenario that she was in, and she said, "You know what? I was missing the journey because I was trying to get to the destination."
Yeah.
And so I was like, you know what? Especially I think for my generation, boomers and Gen X, where we're goal oriented, so we're looking for that goal, and so sometimes we do miss. I
Yeah.
won't say sometimes we miss. And you think you're supposed to capture it all in retirement or something, because you're just trying to kind of hit all these objectives and do these things, because that goes back to what I said. Are you in the third? Are you in the vocation? Are you in the college? Are you going out to the workforce? It's just the way we were kind of our mindset. And so, the statement is, well, are you happy when you're successful, but are you really? Because in the eyes of the world, you're successful by the material things. But if you have a hole in terms of your purpose and where you are, you're not, right? And I think the thing about the millennials and Gen Zs is they want more of the fulfillment. They want to recognize that fulfillment, so that your work isn't really work because it's your passion. Yeah, right. And you can, and whereas I think our training was just a little bit different. And so for me, I admire that. Sometimes you think about what I would have done if I had that kind of approach, not negating what you've done, but just out of curiosity. Wow, even when my own son, who's here on the platform, when he left Wall Street, and just and making that big shift. It was a big shift because from as far as he was a young boy, his focus was to get to Wall Street. And then he got there and he's like, this is not for me, you know. And I know for myself, I would have stayed, I would have pledged just because I'm here. This was my goal. I made it. But he's like, no, let's reset. I need to reset. And he did it at the right time. He reset. He's single. It's just him. He didn't think about it all those years to then building a whole family that he now has to provide for while he's trying to reset. So I do admire a lot of that faith
Mhm.
I'll call it, and boldness. And because I do think that they do try to focus more in on the internal drivers, and not suppress their creativity
Right.
to align. So,
And
yeah.
even with what you were saying, Matthew, in the sense that even though you did that, that experience that you have is definitely helping you with what you're doing now. So you don't look at it as a failure in any way. You look at it as building that experience, building that block, building,
Yeah.
making the person you are today.
Yeah. But I'll say for a period, and my mom could speak to this, we'd have long conversations where I'm like, did I waste time?
Yep, of
Did
course.
I do, could I have been at a certain destination
Hmm.
sooner? Because I was still trained to be a destination-oriented thinker. Like
Right.
I joke with my mom now, but I would say as I'm doing this music journey, I'm trying to relate to this in a very different way than I related to myself in finance. In finance, my mom will tell you, I barely took stock of the victories I had on my way to going from middle school to having scholarships in high school to getting accepted to every school I applied to in college. I took no stock of those
Every Ivy
anything
League.
because that was not, they were just steps for me. And
Hmm.
Right.
then, I probably appreciated the level of work I was able to put in years later, in some ways in a bit of a healthier relationship to myself.
Right.
But but yeah, but I had those real questions of like, oh, should I have done this here? Should I have done this here? But, so much of what we're talking about deals with self-awareness too.
Right.
And points of self-awareness, I think, come at different journeys for everyone. It's a question of, are you in an environment where that type of conversation or dialogue is happening? Are you in a community, whether familially or in your friendships and your university and your workplace, that's open to dialogue around who you are versus like what you are or what you at least like appear to be? But then I think the second layer of question, which deals much more with economic conditions, is presently, can you make that pivot? Right? Like I recognize I was in a privileged position at that point at 23 where, I was able to finesse out of, living in New York, having an apartment,
Right.
because I knew I could go back to Maryland because my parents had space for me. Right. So I actually did a very drastic reset, but I knew I had infrastructure to do that. And I think this might be going off the end a little bit within the pod, but the structures of our lives, particularly in the West, particularly with capitalism, right? It's not super conducive towards fostering questions that take more time to answer than to produce results. And a lot of individuals and families don't have the leverage of going, oh, I can go back home, right?
Right.
Or maybe your job is then paying for your siblings to go to school, right? Or it's paying for your mother's health insurance or your dad's stuff. Like that's a whole different type of scenario, which then deals much more with the social and economic conditions of our environment that force people to remain within like the machine labor industrial complex system that we live in, right? So and that kind of gets into the theme, just to pivot back to you, of why the fluttering even might happen sometimes. Because to flutter, it means that you're not ready to like, you might not be making a living off of your fluttering at that point, right? Do you have people that can support you in that interim? Do you have your basic needs met? And so it just opens the door for a whole other list of questions on conditions that I think have shifted quite drastically economically, um, from the 70s to where we are now in the 20s of the 21st century.